Everyone, thank you very much for coming to the Fulbright School and also for our participants online this afternoon. It's a really great honor for us at the Fulbright School, of Public Policy and Management, to welcome Professor Lin this afternoon. I don't think he needs an introduction. I think you're all familiar with him. One of the world's preeminent development economists, previously Vice President of the World Bank and Chief Economist of the World Bank, and also well-known author of many books and papers which have given a new direction, given a new impetus to the field of development economics. He was the Vice President of the World Bank, the World Bank, at a very delicate time in the history of the evolution of the global economy. If you will remember, in the period after the global financial crisis. So that was a time of tremendous reevaluation of the status of economics as a discipline. As the world came to grips with what was the most serious economic downturn since the Great Depression, and there was a lot of thinking about, particularly in middle income and developing countries, about what the implications of all of that change was for the developing world. And Professor Lin, I think, was a major proponent of rethinking economics and has remained thus ever since in his work at the World Bank and afterwards back as a scholar in China. So what we will do this afternoon is we will have a presentation from Professor Lin, and then after that, our own Professor Vu Tang Tu Anh will lead a discussion with Professor, and then we will open the floor for some questions. And I'm sure you all have many questions, given that we've entered another juncture in the world economy. I'm sure you all have many questions. So with that, I'd like to introduce Professor Lin to give his presentation. A great honor for us to welcome you, sir. We look very much forward to hearing your presentation this afternoon. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. It's a great honor to be invited to give this public lecture. And I'd like to thank the participants online. I also understand there are some participants online, including my friend Fin Top. He is participating this public lecture in Copenhagen. And the topic I'd like to discuss is, the quest for prosperity and how Vietnam can take off in the 21st century. I like this topic because Vietnam has been doing quite well since the turmoil started in 1986. First, many other transition economies, when they try to move from the socialist planning economy to market economy, their economy collapsed, stagnant, hit by the crisis all the time. And their living standards, including their life expectancy, deteriorated. And Vietnam avoids that. Not only avoids that, from 1986 to 2023, in the 37 years period of time, the average annual growth rate in Vietnam was 6.6%. And we know that during the same period of time, the average annual growth rate for the world was 3%. So Vietnam was more than the average of the world growth rate, double. And for the high-income country, it was only about 2.2%. And Vietnam's performance was 3 times of the average of the high-income country. And even compared to other developing countries, in the same period of time, their growth rate was about 5%. And Vietnam was about 30% higher than the average of the middle-income country. And I think Vietnam should be congratulated for this outstanding performance during the transition period. And we know that when the MOE started in 1986, Vietnam was one of the poorest countries in the world. Its per capita GDP was only $238 US, among the lowest in the whole world. And because of very remarkable growth rate in the past 3.5 decades, Vietnam's per capita GDP reached $4,282 US. Vietnam now is a middle-income country and is going to cross the threshold for the upper middle-income status. And Vietnam is very ambitious. Not only want to be an upper middle-income country, Vietnam want to be a high-income country by the time of 2045. And that's 20 years from now. And 20 years from now, if you realize your target, your dream, you will be a high-income country. And you will see the transformation in your lifetime, in one generation. And this goal is very ambitious because for all the middle-income countries, to become a high-income country has been the dream for every middle-income country. And in 1960, there were 101 middle-income economies in the world. And by the time when I became the chief economist of the World Bank in 2008, among those 101 middle-income economies, only 13 became the high-income economies. So the probability of success is very low. And not only so, if you look, since the Second World War, among those low-income economies, up to now, only 2 were able to become high-income economies. One is Korea. The other one was the place where I was born, Taiwan, China. And the mainland China is likely to be the third one this year or next year. And so for the low-income country or for the middle-income country, to be able to move up to the high-income status, it's a challenging job. It's a challenging job. Certainly for me, as someone working on economic development, I think the performance is very disappointing. And so this afternoon, I'd like to provide my perspective from the new structural economics which I advocated, after I became the chief economist of the World Bank, and to provide some insight for the friends in Vietnam about how to avoid the middle-income trap, because more the middle-income country were trapped in that status for 50 years or for century, and to achieve the goal of becoming a high-income country, to enjoy the prosperity, to improve the quality of life for the people. So that's what I want to do this afternoon. And our goal is to become high-income country. High-income country means you have high income, right? And currently we have low income, we have middle income. And if we want to have high income, certainly not only we need to bring a lot of money to our people. If we only print the money to our people, you will just inflation, right? And then we need to raise the productivities. But how to raise the productivities? It's something new in the human history. Because before 18th century, if you look income of the people in the world at that time, every country was poor. And they all had in common. They all living on agriculture. Like Vietnam, when the war started, they all live in agriculture. At that time, their income level, their productivity was very low. And only after the 18th century, started in Britain, later on in Western Europe, North America, they started a process called the Industrial Revolution. They started to move from agriculture to manufacturing, and they move up the manufacturing ladders. By that way, they improve their productivities. And they were lucky. Unfortunately, the rest of the world did not catch up that trend. They do tend in the agriculture, we tend to be poor. And as a result, the income gap between those industrialized and those not industrialized become larger and larger. And we have something called the Great Divergence. And as a result of Great Divergence, those countries, those economies stay in agriculture, became colonies or formal colonies, or those industrial powers. And Vietnam certainly is one of the countries. Right? and so if you want to raise the productivity, you need to have a structural transformation from an agrarian economy to become an industrialized manufacturing economy, move up the industrial ladders, and gradually to high tech. And to serve the high tech, you also need to have the service economy and so on. That's what we observe. That's the nature of modern economic growth. And not only you need to move up the industrial ladders, you also need to provide the infrastructure to make the modern technology, modern industry possible. Like Jonathan and I, we study rice economy, right? If you want to adopt modern variety, you need to have irrigation. If you do not have irrigation, you cannot apply modern varieties. And if you want to move to manufacturing, you need to have power. If you don't have power, you cannot use modern machines. And not only you need to have power, you need to have raw network, because manufacturing using modern machine, they have economy scales. They produce a lot. And you need to share the goods in market far away. And you need to have the road, you need to have port in order to ship your goods to faraway market or go into international markets. And in this process, to make investment in the modern industries, it's very expensive. You need to have a lot of capitals. And you need to have a financial system to be able to mobilize the capitals in order to support the investment in the modern manufacturing sectors. And not only so, because now you change from poor agrarian economy at that stages, you only trade with people who you know in local periodical markets. But gradually, when you move to the modern manufacturing or modern agriculture, you ship the good far away and trade with the people you don't know. And the goods are so valuable, so you need to have a contract. And then you need to have a law to enforce the contract. You need to have a legal system and so on. So from that, we know the nature of modern economic growth. The end result is continuous rising of income of the people. But underneath of that is a process of structural transformation. The transformation in the production structure from the traditional technology to modern technology, from traditional agricultural production to manufacturing, gradually to the services and so on. So transformation in the production structure. So transformation in the infrastructure as well as institution. That's all. And you know, since we know the nature of modern economic growth, and we hope this modern economic growth can happen in our country. And I try to study this. What determines the structure in a country? How come high-income country, they have those kind of manufacturing-based or service-based production structure? How come we remain in the structure of agrarian economy? What are the determinants? And what are determinants for the change in the structure? And I want to use modern economic approach to understand the determinant of the structure and the driver of the change of the structure. And in the economic profession, if I use the modern economic approach to study structure and structural evolution, I should refer to my studies as structural economics. For example, if I use the modern economic approach to study agriculture, we refer that as agricultural economics. To study finance, we refer that as financial economics. Now I want to study structure and structural evolution, then I should refer my study as structural economics. But the reason why I call them new structural economics was because in 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, up to 1970s, in the development economics, there was a school called structuralism. And I want to distinguish myself from those older school of economic structuralism. So I refer myself as new structural economics, just like new institutional economics. You know, Douglas North started to propose the use of modern economic approach, that is neoclassical approach, to study institution and institutional evolution. He should refer to his study as institutional economics. But in the US, at the end of 19th century, early 20th century, there was an institutional school. And he wanted to distinguish himself from institutional school. So now, you know, those type of study was considered as new institutional economics. So new structural economics, the new had the same implication as new institutional economics. Okay. And certainly, the theory can be very complicated, but I can make it very simple. My main hypothesis in the new structural economics that economic structure, including the production structure, infrastructure, institutional structures, are endogenous to what? Endogenous to the factor endowments. We observe high-income country today, if you look into their manufacturing, they are all in very capital-intensive sectors. And if you go into a developing country like Vietnam in the 1980s, China in the 1970s, we were mainly in the agriculture. How come we have difference in this kind of production structure? We know that manufacturing sector gives you high productivities. And if you stay in traditional agriculture, then the productivity level is low, right? And your income level will be low. But how come a country, no, they can enjoy to have those kind of modern, advanced, capital-intensive manufacturing, and we can only have agriculture? It was because the difference in the factor endowments. We mentioned the high-income country, they started their industrial revolution in the 18th century. And in those 2 centuries, they were very competitive. And their manufacturing revolution started in textile, right? Textile today is very labor-intensive, right? So they started with labor-intensive manufacturing. And now they have those kind of very capital-intensive manufacturing because in those 2 centuries, they accumulated a lot of capital. And when they accumulate capital now, capital change from relative skills to relative abundance, and labor force change from relative abundance to relative skills. And this kind of relative scarcity of factors or abundance of factors will determine the competitive advantages. Because now the high-income country, they lose the competitive ones in the labor-intensive industry, and they have to move up to the capital-intensive industries. And vice versa. How come we can only be competitive in sectors which are labor-intensive, or then-intensive like rice, like coffee, or labor-intensive like garment, like textile, like electronics, because those are labor-intensive, and we are capital skills, and we have competitive advantages in those kind of sectors. So from this observation, we know the factor endowments, which are given at any specific time, and which are changeable over time. And it determines the sector which are countries can have low cost of production, can be competitive in domestic market and the international market with the so-called competitive advantages. And if you have all the production structure are consistent with the competitive advantages determined by your factor endowments, your cost of production will be lowest in the whole world. And certainly to have low cost in the production is the foundation for competitiveness, right? So that should be considered as the, ideal, desirable production structure for the economy according to their factor endowments. But our goal is economic development, right? We want to have higher income. But from this analysis, we know if you want to move up to have higher income, you need to change your production structure from agriculture to manufacturing, gradually to capital-intensive manufacturing to raise your productivity. But they are endogenous to your factor endowments, right? So if you want to move up the industrial ladders, you need to change your factor endowments first. Like Vietnam today, relatively abundant in labor force, skills in capitals. You need to change your factor endowments from relatively skills in capital to relatively abundant in capital. And if you can have this kind of transformation in the factor endowments, then you can change your production structure because you change your competitive advantages. But if you change your factor endowments and your competitive advantages, you can only have a low cost of production, right? But competition is a competition of total cost, including the production cost and the transaction cost. Transaction cost is determined by how good your infrastructure, how good your institution. So you also need to improve your infrastructure and institution to reduce the transaction cost, to make your total cost low in the world, and you will be competitive in the world. Okay, so that is the idea, to have a dynamic transformation in a country. And from this very simple understanding, we know some countries which were trapped in low income status or middle income status, that means they don't have a very dynamic structural transformation in their production structure from low productivity, traditional agriculture, or low productivity, traditional manufacturing, and move up to the more capital-intensive, technology-intensive, modern manufacturing. If you do not have those kind of dynamic change, you will stay in a low-income status or middle-income status forever. And with that understanding, certainly we want to raise the income. And if you want to raise your income, you need to change your factor endowments. But what is the best way to change your factor endowments? From the analysis previously, my advice is that to follow percentages determined by your factor endowments. That will be the best way.
If you have your older productions are consistent with your factor endowments, then you can have the lowest factor cost of production. And then supposedly you also have adequate infrastructure and institution. Your transaction cost will be low. And your total cost will be very competitive. And if you are very competitive, you can enjoy large markets, large profit, and you can accumulate capital quickly and change your factor endowments. And you not only change your factor endowments, in this process, a middle-income country, a developing country has one advantage. That is so-called latecomers advantages. For the advanced countries since the Industrial Revolution, they were the highest income country in the world in the past 2 centuries. That means what? Their industries, their technology are on the global frontiers. If they want to have technology innovation, they would have to invent the new technology. If they want to industrial upgrading, they would have to invent the new industries. Invention, if you are successful, certainly is very desirable, but most invention failed. So it's very risky and requires huge capital investment and very risky. High-income country, in general, their growth rate was about, forget about wise, 2%, plus population growth, maybe 0.5% or 1%. So the advantage in the past century, their average annual growth rate is around 3%. But Vietnam could grow at 6.6%. How come? Because you can enjoy something called latecomers advantages. In the process of industrial, the technological innovation, you can have borrow technology, you can imitate technology, you can import technology. And in industrial upgrading, you can do the same thing. You can move up to new industry which new to you, but which may be mature globally. And the product, the market, they are mature. And for you, you can invite foreign direct investment to come, or you can encourage your domestic entrepreneur to enter in those kind of mature sectors. Technology is available, market is available. And also the cost of invention or innovation, cost of industrial upgrading and risk, cost will be lower and risk would also be low. And that allow a developing country to grow much faster than the developed country, like Vietnam, 6.6%, about 3 times of the high-income country. And if you can have a faster growth, certainly you can narrow the gap with the high-income country. You can move up from low income to middle income, even to high income. Okay, that's the ideal. Can I move? Okay. But to follow the competitive advantages in the process of the technological innovation and the industrial upgrading, the concept certainly is easy to understand for us study economics. But how can you make that a spontaneous choice of entrepreneurs, of industrialists? We know entrepreneur industrialists, actually they do not care competitive advantages. They care about profitability. And how can you make their pursuit of profit to make a choice consistent with the competitive advantages determined by the factor endowments? For that, you need to have one institution. That is a market institution. Why? Because you need to have relative factor prices reflect the relative scarcity of your factor endowments. That means what? If you are relatively abundant in labor force skills in capitals, then your first should, relatively inexpensive in and very expensive in capital. And if you have those kind of price signals, entrepreneur, if they want to be profitable, then they should find industries which can use a large amount of inexpensive factors. That's the abundant labor supply, right? And only use a little of capital. Those industry is labor-intensive industries. And once they enter into the industry, they should find way to use a lot of labor in the production process and only use a little capital in the production. And those kind of technology is labor-intensive technology. That's consistent with the Fulbright empowerment, and vice versa. And if you accumulate capital become relatively abundant, become relatively inexpensive, then the entrepreneur should find a way to enter into new industry which can use more capital. Then that will be relatively abundant in capital, relatively abundant in capital-intensive industries. And once they enter into the industry, they should find a way to use capital, machine, to replace the workers. Then that will be capital-intensive technology. So you need to have those kind of price signals. How can you get a price signal? So far, the only way is through competitive market. So market is very important for a country to follow the competitive advantages in the process of economic development. But is there any role for the state? Yes, because we are talking about dynamic economic growth. We are not talking about static resource allocation. We want to move up industrial leaders once we accumulate capitals. And when we want to move up the industrial leaders, we need to improve infrastructure, like irrigation, or like road network, port facility, power supply. We also need to improve the institution, financial institution, legal institution. And there's a lot of coordination. There are a lot of market failures, and you need to state to help the entrepreneur to overcome those kind of market failures and to provide adequate infrastructure and institutions for the new emerging industries. So you need to have a facilitation state as well. Efficient market and a facilitation state are two essential institutions for a country to have a very dynamic economic growth in a modern time. And this actually explains those huge successful economies. According to the Growth Commission report, headed by Robert Solow and Michael Spence, those two Nobel laureates, they found that there were certain economies after the Second World War. They enjoy 7% or more growth rate. That means their growth rate double the high-income country growth rate, or triple the high-income country growth rate. It's 7% or more, because high-income country, their growth rate was about 3%. And this successful developing country, they grew at 7% or more, continuously for 25 or more years. If you can have double or triple the growth of the high-income country for 25 or more years, certainly you will narrow the gap, you will move up the industrial leaders, income leaders, right? And among these certain economies, the Growth Commission report found they have 5 things in common. One, they are open economy. Secondly, they have macro stability. Third one, they have high saving and high investment. First one, they are market economy or more to the market. And last one, they all have very proactive facilitation state. Okay, this report was released by the World Bank before I became the chief economist. In 2008, and I joined the World Bank in June 2008. They released the report in May 2008. And since Michael Spence was the chair of this commission, after this report was released, all the developing countries were very excited and invite Michael Spence to advise the government, including, I'm sure, Vietnam. How can we enjoy this high growth for such a certain period of time. And the advice by the Michael Spence was that, well, those 5 status facts are the ingredients of success, but there's no recipe. Whereas we used to rely on herb medicine, right? And you have other ingredients. But if you do not have recipe, you cannot cure the disease, right? Because same ingredients can be good for your health, can be bad for your health, very much depends on the condition, right? So you need to have recipe. And when Michael Spence was invited to invite the head of state, he introduced the Growth Commission report and talked about the 5 ingredients. And when the head of state asked him, then how can we do it? He said, well, there's no recipe. And if there's no recipe, and it's not helpful, right? But actually, there's a recipe. The recipe is a recipe from the new structural economics. Because the new structural economic recipes that follow the competitive advantages determined by your factor endowments at any specific time. You have factor endowments, right? And at any specific time, you always can find some competitive advantages. But if you want to follow your competitive advantages, there are 2 preconditions in institution. One is efficient market. So you can provide the right price signal to the entrepreneur to guide their decision. And if you have this, entrepreneur follow your competitive advantages, they are going to be very competitive. They are going to accumulate capital very fast. They are going to upgrade their industries. And you want to make the upgrading of industry possible and to ensure they come out advantages, you need to have the government to facilitate in the improvement of infrastructure and institution. So if you want to be successful to follow your competitive advantages, you need to have 2 institutional preconditions. One is efficient market. The other one is proactive facilitation state. Those are condition number 4, number 5 in the Growth Commission report. And if you follow your competitive advantages, certainly it will be open economy. You produce something which you have competitive advantages and you export. And you import something you don't have competitive advantages, right? And so you are going to be very open, just like Vietnam today. I know your trade dependent ratio is about 200% of GDP because you export a lot of things which you have competitive advantage. That's labor intensive. And you also import a lot in a capital intensive type of goods. So you will be open economy. So that's condition number 1. And if you follow your competitive advantage, you are very competitive. You are not going to have homegrown crisis, right? Because you are competitive. And not only so, if you follow your competitive advantages, you export a lot, you will grow very high. The government revenue is going to be, high, right? The government have a lot of revenue. And if we have a shock from outside, the government will be in a good position to adopt counter-cyclical intervention. Not only the government revenue will be high, and you can also have an adequate foreign exchange reserve. So allow you to be able to adopt counter-cyclical interventions. So you are going to have less homegrown prices, and if you encounter shocks, you will be in a much better position to adopt counter-cyclical intervention. So you are going to be more stable than otherwise, right? So the condition number 2 actually is also a result of following the competitive advantages. And if you follow your competitive advantages, you are going to be very competitive, right? So you're going to create a huge profit. And also investment is going to have a very high return. So certainly you're going to save more, you're going to invest more. So from this, we find those 5 status facts are the result of a developing country following their competitive advantages. And among those 5 status facts, 2 are precondition, institutional precondition, efficient market and proactive government. And the other 3 are the results of following competitive advantage. Openness, macro stability, high saving, high investment. So I now seem to have a secret recipe to recommend to follow your competitive advantages. And in this process, to have a facilitation state using industrial policy would be very important. Because in the process of industrial upgrading, developing, yes, you need to identify target support to sector which you have competitive advantages. And you need to improve infrastructure. But infrastructure in a developing country is very poor almost everywhere, right? You also need to improve institutions. And institutions are poor almost everywhere. But the government resources are limited. The government implementation capacity is also limited. So you need to use your capacity strategically, or use Mazzucato's terminology. You need to have an entrepreneurial state. You need to pick sector which you have competitive advantages. And then you need to provide adequate infrastructure and institution for those sectors. And you will not be able to improve the institution and structure for the whole nation because your resources are limited. And if only target a few sectors and provide them support, then it's industrial policy, right? So for a facilitation state to perform the function of supporting sector which you have latent competitive advantages, you need to be selective. You need to pick the industry, and you need to understand what they need, and allocate your limited resources, including implementing capacity, to make an infrastructure good enough, institution good enough for those industries. So industrial policy will be essential. And industrial policy is essential from my understanding. But the story is that almost all the developing countries use industrial policy after they gain political independence. But most of them fail. As a result, industrial policy became a taboo in the world. If you go to Washington, they are not going to talk about industrial policy, especially those multilateral development institutions and so on. They all advise you. The government should not pick winners. The government should not use industrial policy. But the issue is that if you do not pick winners, if you follow the recommendation, you improve the institution for the whole nation, and you improve the infrastructure for the whole nation, then things will happen spontaneously. But you don't have enough resources. How can you improve the infrastructure in Vietnam to be as good as like China today? Right. But you don't have so many resources. It's impossible. And so if those kind of recommendation is a recommendation for stagnation, because you're not going to have dynamic economic growth. But the issue is that almost all the countries adopt industrial policy, but they fail. The reason is that most industrial policy targeted wrong sectors. For the developing country, in general, the government is too ambitious. Try to develop industries which are so advanced, look so sexy, but they are very capital intensive. And they also require very sophisticated institution and infrastructure. And you do not have the capital. And so they are not viable because they're in sector which you do not have competitive advantage. Their cost of production is going to be higher than those countries with adequate capital. And your infrastructure institution is going to not adequate. And the government intervention always becomes some kind of source of risk. You're causing misallocation of resources, and the government support to those kind of sectors become a rent. and become recipient. And industrial policy is also used in the advanced country. And most of them also fail. For example, now in the US, they want to use industrial policy to attract relocation of government industries from Vietnam back to US, right? Does the US have competitive advantage in the production of government? I'm sure US cannot compete with Vietnam. And since they cannot compete with Vietnam, and they want to have those industry, the government would have to subsidize them, right? Hugely, right? And the subsidies will become misallocation of resources and risky. So it's going to be a failure also. So industrial policy is essential. But remember, industrial policy to be successful need to target the sectors which the country has competitive advantages. But the sector which you have competitive advantage, but they are not realized yet. So I call them latent competitive advantages. But latent, how can you identify sector you have latent competitive advantages? The new structural economics provide a framework for you to understand that. Basically, I classify the industries in a developing country like Vietnam into 5 categories. Some industries that you already enters or you are about to enter, but higher income country also operate in those kind of industry. You are in a catching up process. In general, what you produce in low value added segment of that industries. In high income country, they produce that product in the industry at higher value added sectors. And you are in the catching up stage. A lot of manufacturing in Vietnam today are in that categories. Secondly, you may have some industries which are already on the global frontiers. Although a middle-income country, you may have some industries. You are the global leaders. There are several reasons, because many advanced countries may already exist from that industries. So it gives the room for you to be the global leaders. And if you're a global leader, you want to stay in the sectors. You also need to have technological innovation that's upgraded in the sectors. That's the second category. The third category is that in some sectors which used to have competitive advantages, but because of rising wages, the wage rate rose quickly in Vietnam from what I heard. And so for very labor intensive industry, you are losing competitive advantages and how to help those industries. And the fourth one is that the fourth industrial revolution gives the middle-income country like China or like Vietnam an opportunity to leapfrog, to compete with the advanced country, because they are new for all the countries in the world, no matter their middle income or their high income. And those industries in general have certain kind of characteristics. Their innovation cycle is very short. 6 months, 12 months, 18 months have one innovation cycles. And certainly they need to have capital. But innovation cycle is so short. So the most important inputs is human capital. And for a country like Vietnam, you have 100 million. It has sufficient human capital, especially with your education in the last few decades. Then you have the opportunity to compete in those kind of sectors. The leapfrogging sectors. The last sector is that just opposite to the leapfrogging sectors. They are very capital intensive. They require long invention cycle, maybe 10, 20, 30 years. They are very capital intensive. In general, a middle income country do not have competitive advantage in those kind of sectors. But those kind of sectors may be important for national security, for economic security. So we have no choice. We need to do it, just like a semiconductor chips. Those very sophisticated semiconductor chips. It's not competitive advantage of China, but now China cannot buy that globally. We have to produce that ourselves, and the government need to support. So for the middle-income country, we can divide the manufacturing sector in this Y type and identify the areas of market failures for the government to support. For the catching up industry, in general, you look into countries which currently their per capita income were, twice, 3 times, or 20, 30 years, they are at a similar stage of development, but now they are more advanced. And you look into what kind of industry were their competitive sectors in those 20, 30 years. And if they are very competitive in those kind of sectors for 20, 30 years, which is dynamic economic growth, income growth, they're going to lose competitive advantage in those kind of sectors. If they lose competitive advantage, it might be your latent competitive advantage that you can enter. So the first one is to identify sectors in countries which similar capital and similar endowment structure of yours, and they operate in those kind of sector for 20, 30 years. They are very competitive in those 20, 30 years. And they are going to lose competitive advantages, and those might be your latent competitive advantages. And if you identify those kind of sectors, then you come on to see whether you already have some domestic entrepreneur enter into the sectors. And if they enter into the sectors, they have the tacit knowledge. But how come they cannot be competitive in higher value segment? What are the barrier? And try to understand those kind of barrier. And with the understanding, the government, can do a few things. If you already have some firm enter, then you try to understand what are the barrier for them to move up. If you have not entered, then you can think why your reference country, they would not relocate their production to your country. What are the barriers? Very often can be infrastructure. Very often it can be business environment. The government, can help to remove that by setting up industrial park and so on. Certainly for a developing country, you may have some sectors that are unique to you. And an entrepreneur already operate in those areas. For example, coffee. Vietnam is the global leader, produce a lot, China cannot compete, right? And you need to identify what are the barriers for them to upgrade. Because what I heard, although you export, you are the number 2 exporter of coffee, but you only have 2% of the volume. And how come they can only have 2% of volume? What are the barriers for them to move up the value added? And then if it's an infrastructure, we can set up industrial parks or export processing zone. And if it's an institution, you can also, within the industrial park or processing zone, to have one-stop service to make infrastructure and institution good enough in those kind of enclave. And that would be a way for the government to play the facilitation role. And the government can also provide some incentive. If this is new for domestic entrepreneur, you can provide some tax incentive, or you want to attract foreign direct investment to come, you can provide some tax incentive for the first 5 years and something like that to attract them to come. So that is the industrial policy that the government can use to support the sector which you are in the catching up stage. And if you have some industry which are already on the global frontiers, if they want to stay in that global frontiers, certainly they need to invent new product. They have to invent new technology to increase the value, to increase the efficiency. But invention has 2 parts: basic research and development of new product, new technology. Entrepreneurs, firms would have high incentive to do the development of new product or the new technology because they can get a patent for that. But firms in general, they don't want to invest too much on the basic research. But without a breakthrough in the basic research, then it's very hard to have a new development in technology or product. So the government need to support the basic research that needed for those segments which you have are already on the global frontier, like the high-income country. The high-income country, they support basic research only because their industry, their technology are on the global frontiers. And the government need to allocate resources to support that. That's the reason why Machu Picchu, name the government in the advanced country as entrepreneurial government, because they need to target those kind of sectors and the mobile resources to support the basic research in those kind of sectors. In addition to support basic research, the government can also use procurement as a way. If the new technology, new product has been developed by your firm in those kind of sectors, the government can use a procurement to make their production quickly reach economy scale. The government can also help them to penetrate into the global markets. And if you are the global in those areas, the government can be, help the firm to go to the global market, to enter into the global markets. So that is the government can do to support the sector which you are on the global technological frontier. Then how to help the sector which you are losing competitive advantages. For that, you can adopt policy to encourage the firm to go to so-called the two ends of the smile curve: branding, product design, or marketing. Those kind of activities have higher value added. But if you want to have branding, you need to have your own products. And you need to have a product design. And that requires certain talents. And you need to help train those kind of talents by some kind of vocational school and so on. And if you want to do the marketing, then you also need to have knowledge of the global market and so on. And you may set up some kind of MBA program and so on to train those people to support this industry. And then for the production part, in general assembly part, it's very labor intensive. You are losing competitive advantages. And how can you do that? There are two ways. One is to use automation, especially now artificial intelligence and so on. You can use robot in the production to reduce the cost. That's one way. The other way is to help the firm to relocate their production to regions which still have low wages, like in Vietnam, right? Ho Chi Minh City wage rate would be much higher than other provinces, right? You can help the firm to relocate the production to those areas, or to relocate the production to other countries with low wages. And then they can help you to turn the so-called GDP from GMP, right? Production in abroad, but part of your revenue and so on. So that's industrial policy to support the sector which you are losing competitive advantages. And how to have industrial policy to support sectors which you may be able to leapfrog. Well, this kind is a new opportunity for middle-income countries like Vietnam, certainly also like China. And you need to identify, let's say, artificial intelligence or big data. And for that, because of the main input, it's human capitals. In a country with large population like Vietnam or like China, certainly we have sufficient talent in those kind of opportunity. And for that, you can set up some kind of incubation centers. You can set up some kind of venture capital fund. When your talented people have good ideas, allow them to be able to make their idea become products. In the process, the government can give some financial support, tech support, or office space support. And once they have, or once they have a new invention, certainly you need to have intellectual property right, protection to them. And the government can also procure new products. should allow them to scale up their production quickly. So that's the way for you to capture the opportunity rising from the fourth industrial revolution. That's one sector which you don't have competitive advantages. But due to security reason, you need to have that. For that, the government would have to subsidize them. In the past, in general, the government used distortion in the prices and so on to support them. But follow this, ideas of new structural economics. Those sectors will be very small. Firm in those kind of sector is very small. And the best way is to use fiscal appropriation to get direct support. Instead of with only by distortion in the, let's say, interest rate, financial repression, or distortion in the foreign exchange rate and so on. The best way is the government direct to use fiscal appropriation to support those kind of sectors. And by that, the government will also be easier to supervise their operation and so on. So those are the 5 types of industrial policy and target for And I'm sure it will be the last page, I know. So let me conclude. Okay. To realize the goal of 2045, to move from a low middle income country to become high income country in 20 years' time, it's ambitious, but it's feasible because I can look into China. In 2023, your per capita GDP was 4,300. That was similar to China in 2005. Similar to China in 2005. And most likely, this year or next year, China will become a high-income country. Because for the high-income country, the threshold today is $14,005 US. Last year, 2014, the per capita GDP in China was $13,840 US. And very likely, China this year can cross the threshold of high income status to become high income country. If China do not do that this year, I think that next year China will be able to do that. So with a similar status, China realized the dream of becoming a high income country in 20 years. If China can do that, Vietnamese people can do that also. So thank you very much for this opportunity to exchange ideas. And 20 years is not too long, so maybe I can come back. And when you become the high income country, I can say 20 years ago, I said, you can do it. You see, you do it. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Professor Justin Yifu Lin, for sharing the insights with us. As promised, I'm going to ask you very difficult questions today. In the last few days, you spent time in Hanoi, right, to talk with the Vietnamese leaders, both from the party and from the governments, and also talk with the, intellectuals and research community in Hanoi. And you already know that Vietnam is in a critical juncture right now. So the reforms that the party and the government is initiating now is not only one in the lifetime, but probably once in about 200 years, right? From the governance and from the economic policy perspective. So if you are in the position to advise the Vietnamese government to achieve like 2-digit economic growth rate in the next 20 years, right, continuously, what would you say?
Well, first, I come here to learn instead of come here to give advice. As I mentioned, Vietnam has done very well since the turmoils in 1986, because most countries in the transition period, the economy collapsed, stagnant, hit by crisis. But in those 37 years, Vietnam maintained stability and enjoy a very dynamic growth. As I mentioned, 3 times of high-income country, 2 times of the world average, 30% higher than middle country. And from the performance, there's no doubt. The governments know the situation. The policy in Vietnam, I would give them an A. I cannot say everything was right, but overall, to have that performance is remarkable, and they should be congratulated. And certainly, I like to learn how that was possible in Vietnam. And secondly, from my own understanding about those a few successful economies since the Second World War, I find something in common. You need to have a high goal in order to inspire the people. But you need to be very pragmatic in your approach. And because you want to become an industrialized country, you want to capture a high-income country, you need to have a high goal in order to have higher growth. But you need to be very pragmatic in your agenda. Because I can look, after the Second World War, those few successful economies, they all have something in common. They adopt some policies which were considered as wrong policies by the mainstream ideas at that time. For example, I mentioned the structuralism. Structuralism was the first generation of development economics. And it appeared in 1940, 1950, 1960s. At that time, the former colonial country, gaining political independence, or semi-colonial country like China, success in the revolution, and the government started to pursue their own national agenda. And they all had a dream to become an advanced country, right? The goal is very high. And to help the developing country, so there are new sub-discipline called development economics to emerge in modern economics. And the first generation, now we call structuralism. At that time, because the goal for the developing country was to become an advanced industrialized country. So you can have same productivity, you can have same income level. But if you want to have same productivity, you need to have similar industry, right? So you need to develop advanced capital intensive industries. But developing countries at the time, but industry, they have many traditional agriculture. The productivity level was so low. So the country want to develop the advanced capital intensive industry, then the economists analyze. Well, if advanced industry is so good, how come the developing country could not develop those industry? They said there were too many market failures due to structural rigidity in culture and something like that. Because to invest in the capital intensive industry, you need to have a lot of capital. You need to save a lot. But in a developing country, in general, farmer would not save. They consume almost everything, right? Just like in Vietnam a few decades ago. And they said, well, how come they would not save? Because of culture, because of all kind of reason. And so at that time, the advice to the developing country from the development economist was to use the government to mobilize resources to invest in those kind of advanced industry. In socialist country, we did that. In Latin America, although they are not socialist country, they did that also In African country, they also do that. Very conventional, right? But country follow that approach in general. They may enjoy a few years of dynamic economic growth, mainly because of investment. But once those kind of industry was built up, they became so-called white elephant, very inefficient, require government protection and subsidies all the time. As a result, the economy stagnant, and they started to hit by all kind of crises. How come they have all kind of crises? Those industry require a lot of investment, but they did not generate money. But you have young people emerge, they want to have job, and you could not provide them job, they were not happy. So you are going to have all kind of social political tension. And during that time, only a few economies in the world, mainly in East Asia, Korea, my home province, Taiwan, and Singapore. They did not develop capital-intensive industries. They started with traditional small-scale labor-intensive industries. At the time, that kind of development approach was considered as wrong. The goal is to catch up the high-income country, right? They have those kind of capital advanced industry, their productivity was so high. And you develop those small-scale, labor-intensive traditional industries, their productivity is so low, how can you catch up? So they were considered as adopting wrong strategies. But so what? A huge developing country to enjoy stability and dynamic growth and narrowing the gap was those a few developing economies adopted wrong strategy considered by structuralism. Then, because most of the developing countries were hit by all kind of crises, the development idea changes. By the time of 70s, 80s, it became neoliberalism. They started to say, well, after the independence for 30 years, how come we're still so poor? And the understanding at that time, well, your government had too many interventions, caused all kind of distortion, misallocation of resources, and raising kids. Look at the high-income country, how come they can have high income? Because they have well-functioning institution, market institution, respect property right, allow market to allocate resources, and government is disciplined, they have limited government. Okay, and they maintain the macro stability. So the idea became the so-called neoliberalism, or to some extent new institutional economics, to good institutions. And they said the reason why the developing country could not do well because they don't have those good institutions. And how can you have good institution? You need to eliminate all the government intervention. So marketization, the market determines the price, so you can have good allocation of resources. Privatization, because if you have a government intervention, you're going to have so-much constraint. You're going to have too many interventions. So you should privatize or still on the prices. And the government's role is to maintain macro stability. So you should have you should not have a budget deficit. The government should be limited. So the stabilization, again, very conventional. So almost all the transition economy in former Soviet Union, in Eastern European country, in Latin America, in Africa, took that advice because they're so conventional. But unfortunately, although they are very conventional theoretically, countries follow that approach. In general, their economic collapse, stagnant, hit by crisis all the time. And if you look into their performance, their average annual growth rate was lower than during the period of structuralism. And if you look into the frequencies of the crisis, was even higher than during the structuralism. So some economists refer that period as lost decades for the developing world. If you study, use that term. And if you look into Vietnam, China, to some extent Cambodia, and one country in Africa, Mauritius, they started even earlier than ours, and they started in early 1970s. They started with all kind of distortion due to the structuralism, due to the good intention of develop advanced capital intensive industry, causing all kind of distortion, very inefficient. So certainly we need efficiency, and we need to have the more in every country, right? At that time, the idea was that if you want to move from those economy with all kind of government intervention to a well-functioning market economy, you need to remove all the distortions simultaneously, so the structural becomes in. That's one consensus. The other consensus is that country like China, to some extent, might be country like Vietnam, you are going to be even worse than pre-superior. Because although you want to move to the market, but your government retain too much intervention. It did not privatize your state-owned sectors, and you need to subsidize your state-owned sectors. And the government also intervene all kind of things. And there was theory, and even a QJ article, to say those kind of half-minded reform. And on the one hand, allow market to emerge to allocate resources. On the other hand, the government continue to intervene and to protect the state-owned sectors. The resource allocation is going to be worse than the planning period of time. The corruption is going to be even more widespread than the previous period. And your economy performance is going to even worse before your transition. Their paper is published in QJE and written by the most famous economists. So they are very conventional. So we will consider it a top-down strategy, right? But we enjoy stability and dynamic economic growth. So that means that, if your government has the ability to adopt policy which will consider wrong, but you think it's right for a country, and you have the competence to implement that, I think your government should take a credit for that. And that's for the past and for the futures. And this tweet is very short for me, but from my very limited context, I think the reason why Vietnam could have those kind of good performance in the past, I see that from my contact with officials. First, they know they have a high goal, and they want to achieve that goal for the country. And they also try to think of what is the best way to achieve the goals. They are open-minded. They willing to hear your analysis or advice. They invite, advisor from abroad, but from what I can see, at the end, they make decision by themselves, according to the situation of your country. I think that just like the Moors, I'm sure during that period, you receive all kind of recommendation and suggestion, but you did not follow all. You took some spirit, and you, based on what you can do well, good for your country. And as long as you keep those kind of mentalities and approach, I do have the confidence that you can do as well as in the past, or even better than the past. Because in the past, on the average, is 6.6%, right? Now you want to have double digit in the coming decades. And so you have to work harder, but in the same spirit, I'm sure you can do it.
Yeah, that's great. This is a very comprehensive answer to my short question. I have one more question, and then I want to give the audience the opportunity to ask questions as well. Yeah, we can talk. But then I recently attended a conference in the National Economic University in Hanoi, and during that conference, there was a question brought up by some people in the audience to ask the former presidents of the Institute for Development Strategy within the Ministry of Planning and Investment, which is a major think tank for the government in terms of strategy. And the question is about the structural transformation, how far we have been going. And then the president of the institute said, basically, we didn't change much, right? And he said that not from the superficial perspective, but from the deep down value added structure. So basically, in the last 20 years, we moved from exporting about 20% of petroleum, and zero, basically no cell phone. Now we export about only less than 2% of oil, and more than 20% of our export basket is cell phone, from Samsung, from and so on and so forth. But the problem is the value added contributed by the Vietnamese firm is less than 3%. And this is the huge challenge for Vietnam. And I think one way to see it is not, of course we want to transform our economic structure, but it depends on the endowment, structure. It depends on the institution. It depends on the government capability. Of course, you already elaborate on those points. But I think another point which is crucial is it depends very much on the structural change in the world as well, because we are not the only one trying to transform ourselves, right? We are acting within the constraint imposed by many other countries. So we don't have that many degree of freedoms. And especially given the turbulence in the geopolitical, scenario now, it's even more difficult for Vietnam to imitate the successful lessons from like China, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and other countries. So from your recipe, right, now apply your recipe to the structural change in Vietnam. What is the missing part that you see Vietnam is having now? And another side of that is doing right is probably not enough. Avoiding big mistakes is another thing. So that's my last question for you before opening it up to the audience.
Well, the question is very good. And to be honest, I'm not in a very good position to answer because I know Vietnam not good enough. So I can only answer the question in a very general principle. You mentioned now you export a lot, but the value added is very small. I think that a common phenomenon for every developing country at the beginning stage of their development. Because at the time, the only competitive advantage is your inexpensive labor force. And you don't have much technology. You don't have much capital. And you only use assembly. And although you export a lot, but you also import a lot intermediate goods. So the value added is very small. And only because that was your competitive advantage at that time. Similar situation in China. For example, when in the past, in early 2000, we had some trade conflict with the US. One example we often use is that we have to export 200 million T-shirts in order to exchange for 1 Boeing 727, because our value added is so small, right? But at that time, well, like I mentioned that 2005, Vietnam today was similar to China in 2005, right? So early 2000 was about 5 or 10 years ago of Vietnam. So that was our only competitive advantages. But certainly now you can move up your industrial leaders because already your per capita GDP was 4,000, about 300. Your capital was not so scarce. Your labor force was not so inexpensive anymore. Under the kind of situation, certainly you should move up industrial leaders. Use my first category, you are catching up, right? And now your competitive advantage should change because now you have more capitals and your labor force are now well trained. Then you should move up to intermediate product that is more capital intensive, higher value added. And you can work with those foreign direct investors to say, in the past, we import all the intermediate goods. Why not we reduce, if in the past, 90% of intermediate goods were imported, why not reduce that down to 50% and produce 50% domestically? And you already have the capital. You always have abilities. And if you negotiate with the investors, unlikely they are going to move away, because that is also consistent with the competitive advantages. If you can produce those intermediate goods locally, it will be cheaper than to import those kind of intermediate goods, especially if the government have a program to support that. So that's the way to move the leaders. And that is also what China did. For example, Apple still, although I know, also assembly in Vietnam, also assembly in India, right? And the wage rate in China is much higher. But the supply chain in China is much better, right? So Apple still, China is still one of the most important bases for producing the Apple, iPhone and so on. So similar. So I think that you can look at opportunity and create a policy incentive. And don't worry that they are going to move away, because they cannot move away, because you have such well-trained workers and a production base here. Then coming to the current global situation, China was lucky to be in an era of free trade, globalization. And now, I think, except a few people, we all know globalization is good for every country. For the developing country, so we can rely on our competitive advantages, and we can move about industrial later step by step. And trade is always win-win, good for, developing country and good for the developed country, because if developing country can grow, certainly people in the developing country will be happier, they'll stay home, they will not become migrants, immigrant to compete for job in the advanced country, right? And you are going to become a larger market for the export of the advanced country, and you can also supply good with good quality, low cost for the advanced country. So that's a win-win. But now we have some kind of trade friction and so on. It's unfortunate. And for that, we discussed it a little bit. I think for Vietnam, the challenge is that trade is win-win for both sides. But smaller economies gains more than the large economy. And so when this trade war started from the large economy, small economy, it's very hard to fight with, because just like people say, I have more car than yours. You're going to lose more if you do not want to trade with me, right? So they can impose a lot of policy and so on, and it's very hard for you to fight. But we know that if we make our market bigger by this way, if Vietnam alone, you're not large. ASEAN, it's not small. Just like United EU, right? Any member country of EU compared to US is small. But EU is as big as US. So EU combined, they can negotiate, because I have car. If you don't want to have trade, fine. Your loss and my loss are in the same magnitude, right? And if you're a small economy, your loss will be much larger. So this my idea is that maybe, on the one hand, you cannot fight alone. And before you form a coalition, maybe you need to show the willingness to negotiate, show the willingness to adapt a little bit. But you cannot only do that. because you experience that. If you accept all the conditions this time, very likely more condition will be imposed. That's what happened in Canada, what happened in, right? During the previous administration, they already revised the NAFTA with the demand of the US. But now they want to have more, right? So you cannot stop here. You can get by some time for negotiation, but at the same time, maybe ASEAN country should work as a group. I think that Singapore knows that very well. Singapore alone cannot fight, but ASEAN together. Maybe, Vietnam is a leader of ASEAN together with Singapore, and call this 10 countries together is large enough to negotiate. And if we have the RCEP, right, ASEAN +3, then our economy is even bigger. And we're in a bigger position to say, well, if you want to impose a position, fine, you're going to lose more than our losses. And our car is stronger, bigger, stronger. And sometimes when you have a bigger, stronger car, then they will give up.
Great. Now I'd like to open the floor to the audience. If you like to have questions, please raise your hand, briefly introduce yourself, and then ask a question. Please keep it brief and concise. Yes.
Hello, thank you for your insights. I'm Yifu, currently a economics major student at Fulbright. I'm very excited to hear your lecture today. So my question follows the question previously posed by Mr. Tan Tuan. So you talked about factor endowment and that Vietnam should focus on its comparative advantage to move up the value chain ladder. But my question is, given the constraint currently, so let's say for the textile and garment industry, Vietnam relies a lot on China in terms of sourcing the intermediary products like fabrics, because we don't have the technological capacity to invest in manufacture fabrics. And then we also used to have a project called, I think it is Đình Vũ factory to produce fabric, and it is state-owned enterprise, but then the project kind of like failed. And then we still relied a lot on the intermediate products from China. So I think I really want to hear your advice on how Vietnam can better navigate amid, there are a lot of alternatives for domestic firms to source outside. And what is the advice for the government to, to better support the domestic industry to move up the value chain ladder? Thank you a lot.
Well, very good. Again, I'm not in a position to give intelligent answer. I think that to answer your question may require to have some research, and a professor and a tool will be able to do that. But here I'd like to stick out of my neck and to make some possible suggestion. I think 10 years ago or 15 years ago, certainly you may not be in a position to move up the value chain in the garment sectors because at the time you don't have sufficient capitals. It's in a sector which you don't have competitive advantages. But now situation is changing, right? Your per capita GDP is already 4,300. If you look at Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, your per capita GDP is about $7,000 US. You are upper middle income economy, and your capital is not so insufficient here. So I think maybe now you have good opportunity, either to encourage the relocation or the production of those kind of textile to Vietnam, because you have sufficient capital and you can improve the infrastructure good enough, and your workers are much well disciplined, much well trained. One possibility. The other possibility is to encourage joint ventures. you have local entrepreneurs, and they are in the government sectors, and they have been very successful. They're also looking opportunity for industrial grading to more higher value added sectors element. And to produce textile, certainly, is one possibility, either from joint ventures or to encourage your domestic firm to enter into that. And especially now during this kind of global trade conflicts, because, if you only do the assembly in processing in Vietnam, your local value added may not be large enough, and they may charge a very high tariff rate. And if you have more local content, you can be exempt for tariff rate. So I think the situation, condition is changing all the time, and you need to change your policy all the time in order to make your production structure consistent with your factor endowments. And the reason why I use factor endowments is I'm defining the new structural economics. I specifically say endowment structure is given at any specific time, but changeable over time. Like say 20 years ago, your per capita GDP is about $300 US, $400 US. Now it's 10 times higher, right? And your capital must be 10 times higher, or even more than that. So your competitive advantage is changing. So you mentioned that the state, support to have a state-owned textile companies failed in the past. That was 10 years or 20 years ago. But the situation is changing because the sector in 10 years, 20 years ago may win against your competitive advantages. But today it can be your competitive advantages because the factor endowment has changed. Okay, thank you very much for the question.
I would like to give the opportunity for the online participant as well. And I saw FinTap is having one question. Fin, can you hear us at all? All right, so I think, I'm going to summarize his question. So basically, he mentioned that Danny Roderick at Harvard University recently said that the era of rapid growth is over, for the future and for the situations that we are experiencing it right now. So what is your comment on Danny?
Well, I don't think that the era of rapid growth was there forever. If you look into average growth rate of the world, has been about 3%. If you look into the growth rate of the developing country, about 4%, right? And only a few countries could grow at 7, 8, 9%, right? So it never been there. That's one thing. Secondly, if you have right policies, then you can always grow much faster. And that is the way we look at new structural economics. Try to find what is the ingredients and recipe for right policy. If you have right policy ideals, you can always grow fast. China achieved 10% growth rate for about 30 years. And for the 45 years, the average growth rate was 8.9%. We never had that growth rate in the human history. So China could grow so fast, not because we are in the era of rapid growth. We are in an era that we can utilize right ideas. So I think a right idea will be more important. And actually, it's a famous quote from Keynes in the large sentence of a last paragraph or last page of general theory. Keynes said, it is ideals, not vested interest, which are dangerous for good or evil. But unfortunately, in our profession, in general, we pay more attention to vested interest instead of ideas. We try to remove vested interest by improving institution and so on. but institution is endogenous. I think your idea is more important. If you have right ideas, no matter under what kind of institutional framework, it can grow. If you have the right ideas, it can grow much more dynamically than other countries at any time in the world.
And fortunately, we are today exposed to a great ideas, right? And that resonates so well with the discussion in Vietnam these days. How Vietnam can take off, how Vietnam can grow as a very high grade. I would like to give one last opportunity for a burning question from the audience, if you have some. So yeah. Đây em, bạn này. Đây, ngay đây này. Sau lưng Jonathan.
Thank you, Professor, for your presence today. I'm a software engineer with a degree in economics, and I'm very interested in your background because I think there's a lot that Vietnam can learn from China in terms of structural changes, as well as in the selection of winners, as you said in your presentation. My first question is,
You have only one question.
okay, it's very related and it will be framed in the same question, right? So it seems like in China, there is a government intervention method at the national level from the state and also at the provincial level, where the province has a lot of autonomy in fostering, like local entrepreneurship, as you said. But also there's also like a very powerful push from the central level where, like recently in technology, there's a crackdown on tutoring industry, gaming industry, also e-commerce industry in China. So it seems like there's power coming from both sides. Whereas in Vietnam, from my subjective opinion, there's only one push from the top down, and the province level doesn't really have a lot of autonomy. For example, Ho Chi Minh City, I believe we have to give our tax money up to 30 or 40% to the central government. I don't know if the same situation applies to China, but I would like for you to share your take on this, like setup, like structural setup in China. Is that one of the primary reasons why China has been like very able to, like promote local entrepreneurship and so on? And just like one quick, like small question. In terms of export economy, do you believe that China is more focused on the domestic market instead of the export market? Because China has such a huge market, inside already with 2 billion people, whereas Vietnam, we only have 100 million people, which is a lot, but nowhere near like the comparison level of China. So perhaps we might have to prioritize, like exports more than China. Yeah.
Okay, but both questions are very good. So please allow me to answer both questions. Yeah. The first question that I have 5 categories of industry for a middle-income country. The central government only responsible for the last category. Those kind of strategically important industry, they need to be subsidized. And only the central government has the ability to subsidize. Because in China, only central government has the power to print money. Only the central government has the right to have deficit. So their budget is more flexible. And when they need to subsidize certain industries, they have the capacity. In the Chinese, local government cannot have the subset. Local government also has no power for printing money. And under the kind of situation, they cannot subsidize specific industries and aggressively. And so they are responsible for the first 4 type of industry. For the industry in the catching up, you already have competitive advantage in those kind of sectors. Only at this stage, your competitive advantage is in a low value add segment, and you want to upgrade to high value added segment. And since your endowment structure already changed, you have latent competitive advantage in the high value added sector, like we mentioned our textile in Vietnam. You don't need to have too much subsidies. You may have to provide some tax incentive. For example, if you invest, I give tax exemption for 3 years or 5 years. And I think that second is already your latent competitive advantage. Your production cost could be low enough. With that tax incentive will be sufficient. So the government does not have to actually spend money, right? You don't have revenue. If they invest, you may not have the revenue for the first 5 years, but it's not a cost, right? And for the second type, you are global leaders. And for those kind of industry, you need to do some R&D by yourself. And local government can support, can encourage local, university to form joint venture with the law firm. They can do several ways. One is to give tax incentive. If they follow the ideas of forming joint venture in those kind of research park, they can have tax exemption. And they can also encourage the university to form joint venture because the provincial government, they control the allocation of resources for education. And if you form those kind of joint venture, the government can give faculty line, students line to support those kind of joint venture. Again, that's also their ability. And then for the third type, you lose competitive advantages, and then you can encourage them to go into the two-year smile curve. You may set up vocational school. Again, the local government can do that. Or you can encourage them to adopt automation. And then, again, tax incentive. If they make investment in those kind of automation, they can enjoy tax exemption or tax incentive. So local government can do that. And for the leapfrogging, again, if you have large enough, let's say, human capital, like in Ho Chi Minh City or Hanoi, you have good university, good engineer education, the government can set up incubation centers. And the cost for that is not that high. So actually, yes, our provincial government or even prefectural government, they are very proactive. But the cost for them is not that high because they're in sectors which we have competitive advantage already. And a little bit facilitation that can come up with a big result. Only sector which are not your competitive advantages, it requires huge protection and subsidies. To some extent, like the government, the tax industry you mentioned. I understand also the shipbuilding you mentioned, you try because you did not have competitive advantages. And it requires huge subsidies. And then when there's huge subsidies, very often become rent seeking and capture. But China is more pragmatic in that way. We identify some sectors which are essential for national security. Central government use fiscal appropriation, and since the fund is coming from central government can supervise. And like in Vietnam, we also have party can monitor also. Yeah. And that's your first question. What's your second question? Huh?
China right now is more focused on its domestic market.
Domestic market. Yeah, and I hear that. Although China has been claimed to be an export-oriented country, but export always not is a small portion. We have the highest export ratio was in 2006. At that time, export was about 30% of our GDP. Currently, export is only about 15% of our GDP because we're a large domestic economy. And a small economy in the manufacturing, if you want to achieve economy scale, certainly you need to export more. Like Vietnam now understand your trade dependent ratio is about 200%. export 100% of your GDP, import 100% of GDP, so you have about 200%. Because economic size in Vietnam is somewhat smaller. And that is the reason why my suggestion, when you face this kind of trade conflict, you need to form a larger coalition. If you look at ASEAN combined, I think the trade dependent ratio will be much smaller, maybe drop down to 100% or even less. And so that is due to the nature of the size of the economy. You know, when you move up your industrial ladder, when you become a high income country, your trade dependent ratio will drop for several reasons. Because by that time, service will become larger. And a lot of services are not tradable. At this stage, manufacturing is still your main element of your GDP. And manufacturing is exportable, so tradable, and you are going to have a larger trade dependence. China is lucky enough, it's big enough. So, you know, in terms of this trade conflict, our economic size measured by market exchange rate, we were about 65% of the US. But if we measure by purchasing power parity, our size is about 130% of the US. So by that, you know, we are about the same size. And so that's the reason why we say, well, you want to impose a tax carrier, why we impose the same. We are going to lose, but you are going to lose also. And we are in a position, and that's the reason why I think that you need to be both hands. On the one hand, to negotiate. On the other hand, to work with ASEAN.
I'm aware that there's remain many questions from the audience, both online, offline, but unfortunately we are over time now. If you have questions, please send us your questions. And if you really want to go deeper into it, please apply to the Master in Public Policy in our program. We just opened up our application a few days ago, and you know, a lot of topics that Professor Lin was discussing would be discussed in detail and in depth in our classroom. Would like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Yifu Lin for your generosity in spending time and sharing your insight with us. And at the end of the day, I believe that Vietnam should be in the position to decide and to navigate, to find the way forward by ourselves, you know, something which is uniquely our own and coming from the necessity as well as the condition of Vietnam. So I think that is the message clearly you spoke out in your lecture. And I would like to thank the audience for very active participation. And we hope that it is the first of the many opportunity to collaborate with you in the future. And whenever you come back to Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh City, it is your home. You know, we would be happy to host you again. And thank you so much. I'd like to thank Mr. Nguyễn Việt Hoàng as well, who is the founder and the president of the Broaden Economics, who helped to bring Professor Lin to us. And we are very grateful to your help and support. And thank you all for your participation.
Well, thank you very much for giving this opportunity to exchange ideas with, you know, so many friends here and so many young people here. And from your eyes, I can see you have high hope for your country, and I'm sure you will contribute to the modernization and prosperity in your country. And I'm so grateful also, you know, so many people participate online. So I can see the photo of FinTap there. Thank you very much for attending this, you know, seminar and discussion online. Thank you very much.